The frozen wind cut through the barren landscape like stone blades, carrying the scent of approaching death. Krog pressed his massive frame against the rocky outcrop, his thick brow furrowed as he scanned the white expanse below. Ice crystals clung to his matted brown hair and the crude mammoth-hide wrappings that barely contained his muscular torso. His weathered hands, scarred from countless hunts, gripped the fire-hardened wooden spear shaft so tightly his knuckles had turned pale beneath the accumulated grime of days without successful hunting. 3 days. 3 days since the mammoth herd had vanished into the northern wastes, taking with them the band's hope for surviving the brutal winter ahead. His people trusted him, trusted his strength, his hunting prowess, his ability to provide when the frozen earth yielded nothing but suffering. The weight of 17 souls depending on his success pressed against his broad shoulders like the ice that coated everything in this merciless season. Back at the caves, Vera would be preparing for tonight's sacred fire ritual, the most important ceremony of the winter cycle. She had been doing it alone since their bond had fractured during the last famine, when harsh words and hungrier bellies had driven them to separate sleeping furs. Tonight, she would call upon their ancestors to guide the band through the dark months ahead, her strong voice echoing through the cavern as flames danced in patterns that spoke to the spirits of the long dead. A sound drifted across the howling silence, not the familiar howl of wolf packs or the sharp crack of shifting ice, but something else entirely, something that made the coarse hair on his thick neck rise despite the numbing cold. Krog's dark, deeply set eyes narrowed beneath his prominent brow ridge as he moved carefully down the treacherous slope, each footstep deliberate and silent despite his considerable bulk. There, huddled against a fallen boulder, like a discarded hide left by careless hunters, lay a figure, female, young, perhaps 20 winters at most. Her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps that created small clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Blood had frozen in dark, rust-colored patches across her torn animal skins, and her long black hair was matted with ice crystals and dried mud. She was clearly not from his band. Her scent was foreign, carrying traces of distant fires, unknown herbs, and territories that lay beyond the familiar hunting grounds. Krog approached with the caution of a seasoned hunter, spear ready to strike. Strangers meant danger in this harsh world, competition for the scarce resources that meant the difference between survival and death, potential threats to his people's continued existence. The smart thing, the practical thing that any experienced leader would do, was to leave her to the merciless elements and continue his increasingly desperate hunt for food. But as he drew closer, studying the way she had positioned herself to conserve body heat even while unconscious, the woman's eyes suddenly fluttered open. They were the color of deep amber, like honey touched by firelight, filled with a startling mixture of physical pain and fierce intelligence that caught him completely off guard. She tried to speak, her cracked lips forming words in a dialect he didn't recognize, but only managed a weak, rasping sound before her head fell back against the cold stone. Strong enough to survive out here this long, Krog muttered to himself, studying her muscular frame beneath the damaged furs. Despite her obvious injuries and exhaustion, he could see the lean strength in her arms and legs, the calloused hands that spoke of hard work and survival skills. But barely holding on now. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the rocky terrain with renewed fury that spoke of a massive storm building in the northern reaches. Heavy snow began to fall in thick, wet flakes that quickly began accumulating on every surface. Soon this entire area would be buried under white death, and any trace of the mysterious woman would vanish completely until the spring thaw revealed whatever remained of her bones. Standing there in the growing blizzard, Krog felt the weight of decision pressing down on him like the approaching storm. Vera's ritual was tonight, the sacred fire ceremony that bound their band to the protective spirits of their ancestors. Bringing a stranger, especially an unknown woman, into such a sacred space would be seen as a violation of their most fundamental traditions. Vera herself would be furious, not just at the disruption, but at what everyone would see as a public humiliation during her moment of spiritual leadership. Yet something in those amber eyes haunted him. In his 35 winters of life, Krog had learned to read the signs that separated the weak from the strong, the survivors from those destined to become food for scavengers. This woman possessed something beyond mere physical endurance. There was a depth there, a suggestion of knowledge and secrets that went far beyond her apparent helplessness. With practiced efficiency born of countless hunts and rescues, he scooped the unconscious woman into his powerful arms, surprised by how her solid frame still felt light compared to the massive prey he was accustomed to carrying. Her head lolled against his broad, hair-covered chest as he began the treacherous journey back toward the caves where his band waited. The storm was building with frightening speed. Already the familiar landmarks were becoming obscured by the swirling curtain of white that threatened to swallow everything in its path. As he trudged through the rapidly deepening snowdrifts, his muscles straining against the combined weight of the woman and his hunting gear, Krog couldn't shake the image of those intelligent amber eyes. There had been something in their depths, something that spoke of experiences and wisdom that might prove valuable to his struggling band, or something that might destroy them all. Behind him, the relentless wind began erasing his tracks, leaving no trace of the momentous decision that would soon shatter his band's fragile world and force everyone to choose between tradition and survival, between loyalty and desire, between the safety of the known and the dangerous promise of the unknown that he now carried in his arms through the growing storm. The familiar orange glow of the cave fires became visible through the swirling snow just as Krog's massive legs began to tremble with exhaustion. He had been carrying the unconscious woman for what felt like half the day, his broad shoulders aching from the weight and the constant battle against the howling wind. The entrance to their winter shelter appeared like a beacon of warmth in the deadly white landscape, smoke rising from multiple fires within the interconnected caverns that housed his band. As he approached the main cave opening, the first to notice his return was Dak, a young male barely past his 18th winter who served as one of the lookouts. The youth's eyes widened in shock as he took in the sight of his leader carrying a strange female, her long black hair trailing like a dark banner against Krog's fur-wrapped arms. "Krog returns," Dak called out, his voice echoing through the cavern system. "He brings someone." The response was immediate. Footsteps pounded against the stone floors as members of the band emerged from deeper within the caves. First came Bren, Krog's most trusted hunting companion, a stocky male with graying hair and scars from a bear attack that had nearly cost him his left arm. Behind him followed Mira, the band's healer, her weathered face creased with concern as she took in the bloodied condition of the stranger. But it was Vera who commanded attention as she strode from the sacred inner chamber, her tall, powerful frame radiating authority. At 30 winters, she was still strikingly beautiful despite the hard lines that survival had carved around her dark eyes. Her thick auburn hair was braided with bone ornaments that marked her status as the keeper of their spiritual traditions, and the ceremonial paint on her face showed she had already begun preparing for tonight's ritual. The moment Vera's gaze fell upon the unconscious woman in Krog's arms, her expression transformed from concern to something far more dangerous. Her nostrils flared as she caught the stranger's scent, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What is this?" Vera's voice carried the authority that came from seasons of leading the band's spiritual life. "Who is this female you bring to our sacred caves on the night of the fire ritual?" Krog lowered the woman carefully to a pile of furs near the main fire, acutely aware of how every eye in the cavern was fixed upon them. Children peeked out from behind their mothers, while the elderly hunters muttered among themselves in voices too low to understand but clearly disapproving. The warmth of the cave began to melt the ice from the stranger's hair and clothing, creating small puddles that reflected the dancing flames. "I found her dying in the storm," Krog replied, his deep voice steady, despite the tension crackling through the air like summer lightning. "She would not have survived another hour in the cold." "And you decided this was our concern?" Vera stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. The bone necklaces around her throat clicked softly with each movement. "On this night, of all nights, you bring a stranger into our most sacred space." Mira, ever practical, pushed past the confrontation to kneel beside the unconscious woman. Her experienced hands quickly assessed the stranger's condition, checking for broken bones and examining the partially healed wounds that marked her exposed skin. "She has been injured recently," the healer announced to the gathered band. "Claw marks, probably from a cave bear, but they are healing cleanly. She has knowledge of herb healing." This information sent a ripple of murmurs through the assembled hunters and gatherers. Knowledge of healing was precious, especially during the harsh winter months when injuries could mean death for lack of proper treatment. But it also raised questions about where this woman had come from and why she was alone in the wilderness. "Her scent carries traces of smoke from different fires," observed Jorik, an older hunter whose nose was legendary for tracking prey across vast distances. "She comes from far away, beyond our territorial boundaries." Vera's expression grew even darker, which means she brings unknown dangers with her, diseases we have no immunity to, information about our resources that could be passed to rival bands, and worst of all, she pollutes the sanctity of tonight's ceremony with her foreign presence. The unconscious woman stirred slightly, her head turning toward the warmth of the fire. Even in her weakened state, her strong facial features and muscular build were obvious to everyone present. This was no weak wanderer who had simply lost her way. This was a survivor, someone who had endured hardships that would have killed lesser individuals. "Look at her hands," whispered Nala, one of the younger mothers. "Those calluses come from working with tools, from making fire, from hard survival. She has skills that might prove valuable," Krog added, though he kept his voice carefully neutral. "The winter grows harsher, and we have lost too many of our food stores to the early freeze. Knowledge from other regions might help us survive until spring." Vera's dark eyes flashed with anger at this implicit challenge to her leadership in matters of band welfare. "And what of the sacred fire ritual? What of our ancestors who demand purity and respect during their most holy ceremony? Would you have me explain to the spirits why we allowed a stranger to witness mysteries that are meant only for those born to our blood?" The question hung in the air like smoke from green wood, acrid and impossible to ignore. The fire ritual was indeed the most sacred ceremony of their winter cycle, a time when the barriers between the living and the dead grew thin, and the spirits of their ancestors could offer guidance for the trials ahead. No outsider had ever been permitted to witness it, much less participate in its ancient protocols. Krog felt the weight of the band's attention pressing down on him like an avalanche. 17 people depended on his decisions for their survival, and now he had brought a complication into their midst that threatened to tear apart the delicate balance of trust and tradition that held them together. The woman's amber eyes haunted his thoughts, but the practical reality of leadership demanded he consider the welfare of those who had followed him through countless dangers. As if summoned by the intensity of the moment, the stranger's eyes fluttered open once again. This time, however, she remained conscious, her amber gaze moving slowly around the circle of faces that surrounded her. When her eyes met Krog's, there was a flicker of recognition and something that might have been gratitude. But when her gaze shifted to Vera, the air seemed to grow even more charged with unspoken tension. "Water," the woman whispered, her voice carrying an accent that confirmed her foreign origins. "Please." The simple request, spoken in their own language despite her obvious foreignness, sent another wave of surprise through the assembled band. How did this stranger know their words? How long had she been traveling in their territory? And what had she learned while watching them from the shadows? Mira quickly brought a crude vessel filled with water to the stranger's lips, supporting her, head as she drank in small, careful sips. The woman's amber eyes remained alert despite her obvious weakness, taking in every detail of the cave and its inhabitants with an intensity that made several band members shift uncomfortably. "What is your name?" Krog asked, crouching beside the furs where she lay. His massive frame cast a shadow over her, but his voice carried none of the harshness that Vera's had contained. "Nira," she replied, her accent making the simple name sound exotic and mysterious. "I come from the southern valleys, beyond the great ice river." A collective intake of breath echoed through the cavern. The southern valleys were legendary among their people, a place of warmth and abundant game that existed only in the stories told by the eldest members of the band. Most believed them to be myths, tales invented to give hope during the darkest winter nights. Yet here was a woman claiming to have traveled from that impossible distance. "The southern valleys are stories for children," scoffed Jorik, though his weathered face showed curiosity despite his dismissive words. "No one has seen them in living memory." Nira's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though pain still clouded her features. "Your ancestors knew the paths. Before the great ice came, before the herds moved north, your people traded with mine. We remember." This statement sent another ripple of unease through the assembled band. Their oral traditions did speak of a time when the world was warmer, when their ancestors had ranged far beyond their current territory in search of trade and new hunting grounds. But those were ancient stories, passed down through so many generations that most dismissed them as elaborate fiction. Vera stepped forward, her bone ornaments clicking ominously. "If you truly come from the southern valleys, then you know nothing of our ways, our customs, our sacred traditions. Yet you arrive on the most holy night of our winter cycle, bringing disruption when we need spiritual harmony." "I know more than you might think," Nira replied quietly, struggling to sit up despite Mira's attempts to keep her resting. The spirits speak the same language in all places, whether north or south. Fire is fire, whether it burns in mountain caves or valley hearths. The audacity of this statement struck the gathered band like a physical blow. For an outsider to claim knowledge of spiritual matters was not just presumptuous, it bordered on blasphemy. Several of the hunters muttered angry words while the mothers pulled their children closer to their sides. Vera's face flushed with rage. "You dare speak of our sacred fire as if it were common flame? As if the ceremonies passed down through countless generations of our people could be understood by any wandering stranger who stumbles into our territory." But before Nera could respond, old Thane shuffled forward from the shadows of the deeper cave. At 63 winters, he was the eldest member of their band, his memory stretching back to times when their territory had been different, when the hunting patterns and weather cycles followed older rhythms. His clouded eyes fixed on Nera with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her physical form to something deeper. "Show me your hands," he commanded, his cracked voice carrying the authority of age and accumulated wisdom. Nera extended her hands without hesitation, palms up. Thane studied them carefully, running his gnarled fingers over her calluses and scars. His expression grew increasingly thoughtful as he examined the patterns of wear and old injuries that marked her skin. "These hands have worked with sacred clay," he murmured, more to himself than to the assembled band. "These scars come from gathering special stones. These calluses, they are from tending fires that burn with more than wood." A hush fell over the cavern. Thane's knowledge of ancient practices was legendary, though most of the band assumed his memories were colored by the fantasies of old age. But his examination of Nera's hands suggested something far more significant than anyone had expected. "What do you see, Elder?" Vera's voice had lost some of its hostility, replaced by a wariness that spoke to her respect for Thane's wisdom, despite her anger at the situation. "I see hands that have prepared sacred fires using the old methods," Thane replied slowly. "Methods that we have forgotten, that exist now only in the oldest songs. If this woman truly comes from the southern valleys, then she may carry knowledge that was lost to us when the great ice separated the peoples." The implications of this revelation sent shockwaves through the band. Their sacred fire ritual was already ancient beyond memory, but Thane was suggesting that even older traditions might exist, traditions that this stranger might possess. Krog felt the delicate balance of leadership shifting beneath his feet, like unstable ground during an earthquake. His decision to save Nera had been instinctive, driven by the hunter's recognition of strength and survival ability. But now it appeared that his choice might have brought something far more significant into their midst than a simple refugee from the storm. "The sacred hour approaches," announced Bren, who had been monitoring the light filtering through the cave entrance. "The sun dies, and the spirits begin their nightly journey. If we are to hold the ritual, preparations must be completed soon." Vera's dilemma was visible in every line of her tense body. The sacred fire ritual could not be delayed. The winter cycle demanded it, and the band's survival might depend on maintaining their spiritual connection to the ancestors. But the presence of an outsider, especially one who claimed knowledge of fire ceremonies, threatened everything she had trained for since childhood. "I will not allow a stranger to contaminate our most sacred rite," she declared finally, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "She must be taken to the outer chambers and kept away from the ceremony." "And if her knowledge could help us survive the winter?" Krog asked quietly. "If the ancestors themselves have sent her to us in our hour of greatest need?" The question hung in the smoky air like a challenge that could not be ignored. Around them, the band members waited for a decision that would shape not only this night, but potentially their entire future. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up toward the natural chimney that carried the smoke away into the darkening sky. Nera watched this exchange with those penetrating amber eyes, saying nothing but clearly understanding far more than a simple refugee should. When she finally spoke, her words were directed not to Krog or Vera, but to Thane. "Elder," she said softly, "in the southern valleys we have a saying, 'The fire that burns brightest is fed by many different woods.' Perhaps tonight your sacred flame might benefit from knowledge carried on southern winds." The old man's clouded eyes widened slightly, and he looked at her with something approaching wonder. "That saying, I have heard it before, in the oldest songs so ancient that I thought they were dreams." As the implications of this revelation settled over the band like falling snow, the time for decision rapidly approached. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, while inside, the tension between tradition and possibility threatened to tear their small community apart. The sacred fire ritual would begin soon, and Vera would be forced to choose between her spiritual duties and her personal feelings, while Krog would have to live with the consequences of his fateful decision in the frozen wasteland. The weight of tradition pressed down on Vera like stones piled upon her chest. She had trained for 15 winters to become the keeper of their sacred fire, learning every song, every gesture, every precise movement that would honor their ancestors and ensure the band's spiritual protection through the dark months ahead. Never, in all those years of preparation, had she imagined facing such an impossible choice. Around the main fire, the band waited in tense silence. Children clung to their mothers' fur wrappings, sensing the adult tension without understanding its source. The hunters stood with arms crossed, their scarred faces showing the strain of conflicting loyalties. Everyone knew that whatever decision was made tonight would echo through their community for seasons to come. Nira remained sitting on the pile of furs, her amber eyes moving from face to face, as if reading the complex web of relationships and emotions that bound these people together. Despite her obvious weakness from injury and exposure, there was something unsettling about her composure, as though she understood far more about their situation than any outsider should. "The ritual fire must be prepared," Vera announced finally, her voice carrying forced authority. "Whether the stranger participates or not, our ancestors demand their due respect." She turned toward the sacred inner chamber, where the ceremonial materials were kept, but Thane's cracked voice stopped her. "Wait, Firekeeper." The old man struggled to his feet, his joints protesting audibly. "Before you decide, there is something you must hear." Vera's jaw tightened with irritation. "Elder, the sacred hour approaches. There is always time for wisdom," Thane interrupted, his clouded eyes fixing on her with surprising intensity, "especially when that wisdom might save us all." He shuffled closer to Nira, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he gestured for her to stand. Despite her injuries, she rose gracefully, her muscular frame unfolding with the fluid motion of someone accustomed to physical challenges. "Show them," Thane whispered to her. "Show them what your hands remember." Nira nodded slowly, then moved toward the main fire with steps that seemed almost ritualistic in their precision. The band members instinctively backed away, creating a circle around her as she knelt beside the flames. From somewhere within her damaged furs, she produced a small leather pouch that had somehow survived her ordeal in the storm. "In the southern valleys," she began, her accented voice carrying clearly through the cavern, "we believe that fire is the bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. But not all fires can support such a bridge." She opened the pouch and poured its contents into her palm, a mixture of what looked like dried plants, crushed stones, and powders in colors that seemed to shift in the firelight. The strange substances gave off a faint, sweet aroma that none of them had ever encountered before. "Sacred fire requires sacred fuel," Nira continued, beginning to sprinkle small amounts of the mixture into the flames. "The ancestors hunger for more than simple wood and dried grass." The moment the mysterious substances touched the fire, the flames changed. The orange glow deepened to rich crimson, then shifted through shades of blue and green that seemed impossible for any natural fire to produce. But more dramatically, the smoke that rose from the altered flames carried scents that spoke directly to some primitive memory buried deep in their minds, scents of distant places, of abundance, of spiritual power that transcended ordinary understanding. The entire band gasped in unison. Several of the hunters dropped to their knees, overwhelmed by the intensity of the experience. Even the children stopped their restless movement, staring at the transformed fire with wide eyes that reflected its dancing colors. Vera stood frozen, her carefully planned ritual suddenly seeming inadequate compared to what she was witnessing. The fire that Nira had created in mere moments carried more spiritual presence than any flame Vera had ever kindled, despite her years of training and devotion to the ancient ways. "How?" Vera whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the transformed flames. "How do you know these things?" Nira's amber eyes met hers across the fire, and for a moment the hostility between them seemed to fade. "Because my people never forgot what yours were forced to leave behind when the great ice came. We have kept the old knowledge alive, waiting for the day when the paths would open again and the separated peoples could share their wisdom once more." Thane made a sound that might have been laughter or weeping. "The prophecies," he muttered, his clouded eyes bright with tears. "The old song spoke of a time when the southern knowledge would return to the north, when the fires would burn with ancient power once again. But Krog," practical leader that he was, saw implications beyond the spiritual wonder of the moment. "If your people possess such knowledge," he said to Nera, his deep voice carefully controlled, "why are you here alone? Why are you injured and fleeing through the northern wastes instead of safe in your warm southern valleys?" The question seemed to hit Nera like a physical blow. The confidence and mystery that had surrounded her suddenly cracked, revealing glimpses of pain that went far deeper than her physical injuries. Her hands trembled as she sealed the leather pouch, and when she looked up at Krog, her amber eyes held shadows that spoke of terrible loss. "Because the southern valleys are no longer safe," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because something has come from even further south, something that devours the sacred fires and leaves only darkness in its wake. My people sent me north to warn the scattered bands, to share our knowledge before it is lost forever." The implications of this revelation struck the assembled band like a cold wind. If Nera's people, with all their ancient knowledge and powerful fire magic, had been forced to flee their homeland, what hope did a small hunter-gatherer band have against whatever darkness was spreading across the world? Vera felt the ground of her beliefs shifting beneath her feet. Everything she had been taught about the purity and isolation of their traditions was being challenged by the evidence of her own eyes. The fire that burned before them carried undeniable power, power that might be essential for their survival in the trials ahead. "The sacred hour is upon us," announced Bren from his position near the cave entrance, where the last traces of daylight were fading into the purple darkness of winter night. "The decision must be made now." All eyes turned to Vera, waiting for the choice that would define not only this night's ceremony, but the future relationship between their band and the mysterious knowledge that Nera carried. The transformed fire continued to burn with its impossible colors, filling the cavern with light and shadow that seemed to dance with meaning, beyond ordinary comprehension. Vera looked at Krog, seeing in his dark eyes the same mixture of hope and fear that she felt in her own heart. Then she looked at Nera, this stranger who had brought both promise and peril into their carefully ordered world. "If the ancestors have truly sent you to us," Vera said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart, "then perhaps they mean for this night's ritual to be different from all those that came before." The decision was made, though its consequences would prove far more profound than any of them could imagine. The sacred inner chamber had never felt so charged with tension. Carved deep into the living rock by countless generations, the circular space was adorned with ancient symbols painted in red ochre and charcoal, spirals, handprints, and animal figures that seemed to move in the flickering light. At the center of the chamber, a shallow depression in the stone floor awaited the ceremonial fire that would connect the living with their ancestors. Vera moved through the preparations with mechanical precision, her hands following patterns learned through years of training, while her mind struggled with the magnitude of what she had agreed to. Around the chamber's perimeter, the entire band had gathered. 17 souls whose survival might depend on the spiritual protection this ritual was meant to provide. Their faces, painted with ceremonial clay and illuminated by torchlight, showed a mixture of reverence and anxiety that mirrored her own turbulent emotions. Krog stood directly across from her, his massive frame draped in the ceremonial bear hide that marked his status as the band's primary protector. The heavy fur emphasized his powerful shoulders and thick arms, while the bear's skull resting atop his head gave him an almost otherworldly appearance. His dark eyes never left Nera, who sat slightly apart from the others, still weak from her injuries but alert to every nuance of the proceedings. "The ancestors gather," Vera began, her voice echoing off the stone walls as she spoke, the ritual words passed down through countless generations. "The veil between worlds grows thin. We, the children of the northern ice, call upon those who walked before us to guide us through the darkness ahead." She reached for the bundle of sacred materials, dried herbs gathered during the summer, special stones found only in certain parts of their territory, and strips of bark from trees struck by lightning. These were the traditional fuels that had fed their ceremonial fires for as long as anyone could remember, blessed by generations of firekeepers who had performed this same ritual in this same chamber. But as her hands closed around the familiar materials, Vera hesitated. Across the chamber, Nera's amber eyes caught the torchlight, and in their depths Vera saw not challenge or judgment, but something that might have been understanding. The memory of the transformed fire in the main cavern burned in her mind, those impossible colors, that overwhelming sense of spiritual presence that had made her own carefully maintained traditions seem pale and inadequate by comparison. "Firekeeper," Thane's cracked voice came from the shadows where the eldest members of the band sat. "The sacred hour reaches its peak. The ancestors grow impatient." Vera's hands trembled as she held the traditional materials. Around her, the band waited in expectant silence, their breathing creating small clouds in the cold air of the deep chamber. Children pressed close to their mothers, while the hunters maintained the stoic expressions that masked their own spiritual uncertainty. "Nira," Vera said suddenly, her voice cutting through the ritual atmosphere like a stone blade. "You spoke of knowledge that was lost to us when the peoples were separated. If the ancestors have truly brought you here on this night of all nights, then perhaps they mean for that knowledge to be shared." A collective intake of breath echoed through the chamber. Several of the older hunters shifted uncomfortably at this deviation from established tradition, while others leaned forward with curiosity that overcame their reverence for custom. Nira struggled to her feet, moving slowly, but with dignity despite her obvious pain. "In the southern valleys," she said, her accented voice carrying clearly in the acoustically perfect chamber, "we believe that the sacred fire ritual is not meant to simply honor the ancestors, but to actually bring them among us, to make the boundary between life and death so thin that wisdom can flow both ways." She approached the central fire pit, her movements taking on the same ritualistic precision that Vera had learned through years of training. But there was something different about Nira's gestures. They seemed older somehow, more fundamental, as though they connected to sources of knowledge that predated even their most ancient traditions. "May I?" Nira asked, extending her hand toward the bundle of materials Vera still held. The moment stretched like a bowstring under tension. Vera knew that what she decided now would define not only this night's ceremony, but her own role as spiritual leader of the band. To refuse would be to cling to tradition at the cost of potentially greater wisdom. To agree would be to acknowledge that her years of training might be incomplete, that an outsider might possess knowledge that their own ancestors had somehow lost. "Show us," Vera whispered, placing the bundle in Nira's outstretched hand. What happened next transformed the chamber into something beyond anything any of them had ever experienced. Nira combined Vera's traditional materials with elements from her own mysterious pouch, creating patterns in the fire pit that seemed to follow mathematical principles none of them understood. As she worked, she began to chant in a language that sounded familiar yet ancient, as though it were the root from which their own words had grown. When she finally lit the prepared materials, the fire that sprang to life was unlike anything that had ever burned in that sacred space. Flames danced in colors that had no names, creating shadows that seemed to move with purpose and intention. The smoke that rose from the ceremonial fire carried scents that triggered memories buried so deep in their minds that they might have belonged to their ancestors rather than themselves. But most remarkably, the chamber itself seemed to respond to the transformed fire. The painted symbols on the walls appeared to glow with their own inner light, while the acoustic properties of the space amplified and changed, making every whisper carry the weight of prophecy and every breath sound like ancient song. Around the fire, the band members began to experience visions, not the gentle communion with ancestor spirits that their traditional rituals sometimes provided, but vivid, overwhelming experiences that felt more real than waking life. They saw their ancestors not as distant figures from legend, but as living beings who walked among them, offering guidance and sharing wisdom with an intimacy that bordered on physical presence. Krog saw his own father, killed in a hunting accident 10 winters ago, standing beside him with the same proud smile he remembered from childhood. The ghost's mouth moved, speaking words of advice about leadership and sacrifice that only Krog could hear. Mira found herself surrounded by generations of healers, their hands guiding hers as they showed her techniques for treating injuries and illnesses that she had never imagined possible. Even little Tam, barely 6 winters old, giggled with delight as she played with the spirit of her grandmother, who had died before Tam was born, but who somehow knew all her favorite games. But it was Vera who experienced the most profound vision. Before her appeared a woman who might have been her own reflection, but wearing robes of a style that predated memory and bearing symbols of spiritual authority that made Vera's own ceremonial markings seem like child's drawings. "You have done well, daughter of my spirit," the ancestral firekeeper said, her voice carrying the wisdom of countless generations. "The knowledge that was lost has returned through unexpected paths. Do not let pride in tradition blind you to the greater truth that tradition was meant to serve. As the visions reached their peak, the transformed fire began to settle into patterns that seemed almost alive, moving with rhythms that matched the heartbeats of everyone present. In that moment, the boundary between individual and community, between living and dead, between past and future, seemed to dissolve completely. But then, at the height of the spiritual intensity, Nera did something that shocked even Thane's ancient understanding. She reached into the heart of the sacred fire with her bare hands, grasping flames that should have consumed flesh, but instead seemed to welcome her touch like old friends. When she withdrew her hands from the fire, they were unburned but glowing with the same impossible light that danced in the flames. She turned to face the assembled band, her amber eyes now reflecting depths of knowledge and power that made everyone present understand that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and spoken of for generations to come. "The fire accepts me," she announced, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from the stones themselves. "The ancestors welcome the return of the lost knowledge, but there is more they would have you know." The chamber fell into absolute silence, broken only by the crackling of the sacred fire and the sound of 17 people barely daring to breathe as they waited to learn what revelation would come next. The sacred fire continued to burn with its otherworldly light as Nera stood before the assembled band, her hands still glowing with the same impossible radiance that danced in the flames. The visions had faded, but their impact lingered in every face around the chamber, expressions of wonder, fear, and confusion that spoke to the profound nature of what they had all experienced. "The ancestors have shown you visions of wisdom and guidance," Nera began, her voice carrying new depths of authority that seemed to resonate from the very stones of the chamber. "But they have also shown me something else, something that concerns not just your band, but all the scattered peoples of the north." Vera felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold outside. The way Nera spoke, the certainty in her voice, suggested knowledge that went far beyond what any individual should possess. "What have they shown you?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. Nera's amber eyes swept across the assembled faces, lingering on each person as though memorizing their features for some purpose none of them could understand. When she spoke again, her words fell into the chamber like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone present. "I am not a refugee fleeing from the southern valleys," she announced, her voice steady and clear. "I am a scout, sent by the Council of the Great Fire to find and evaluate the northern bands. My people have been watching you for 3 full winter cycles, learning your patterns, testing your worthiness." The silence that followed her words was so complete that the crackling of the sacred fire sounded like thunder. Krog's massive frame went rigid with shock and something that might have been betrayal, while Vera's face cycled through expressions of confusion, anger, and dawning understanding. "You lied to us," Bren growled, his hand moving instinctively toward the stone knife at his belt. "You came here under false pretenses, infiltrating our most sacred ceremony." But Nera raised her still glowing hands, and something in her gesture commanded attention rather than defiance. "I came here injured and nearly dead because my mission became more urgent than my own survival. The darkness I spoke of, it is real, and it moves faster than we anticipated. My people sent me to find the worthiest of the northern bands and bring them south before the shadow arrives." Thane shuffled forward, his clouded eyes bright with sudden understanding. "The old prophecies," he whispered, "the songs that spoke of reunification when the great darkness came from beyond the world's edge. We thought they were myths." "No myths," Nera replied, her attention focusing on the ancient man with obvious respect. "Your ancestors and mine shared the same visions, received the same warnings from the spirits. They prepared for this time, scattering knowledge across the land so that when the shadow came, some wisdom would survive to rebuild what was lost." Krog stepped forward, his massive frame radiating the controlled anger of a leader who realized he had been deceived. "And what makes you think we would abandon our territory, our ancestral grounds, to follow a stranger south? What proof do you offer beyond mysterious fires and convenient visions?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, but Nera didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her damaged furs and withdrew something that made everyone in the chamber gasp in recognition, a hunting spear point made from a material none of them had ever seen, black as night, but somehow emanating its own inner light. "This came from the creatures that serve the darkness," she said, holding the alien artifact so that its unnatural glow illuminated her face. They are not animals as you understand them, not spirits as your traditions describe them. They are something else entirely, something that devours light and warmth and life itself, leaving only emptiness behind. Mira moved closer to examine the strange spear point, her healer's instincts overcoming her fear. The material, it's like stone but not stone. Like metal but wrong somehow. It feels cold even near the sacred fire. Because it comes from a realm where fire cannot burn, where the ancestors cannot reach, Nira explained. The southern valleys fell not to war or famine or disease, but to creatures that consume the very essence of life. Where they pass, the land itself dies. Plants wither to dust, animals flee or perish, and even the stones lose their strength and crumble. The implications of her words settled over the band like a suffocating blanket. If such creatures truly existed, if they were moving north as Nira claimed, then no amount of hunting skill or spiritual protection would be sufficient to ensure survival. "How long do we have?" Vera asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The shadow moves slowly because it is thorough," Nira replied. "It leaves nothing alive in its wake, nothing that might threaten its passage. But my scouts estimate it will reach your territory within 2 full winter cycles, perhaps less if its pace increases." Jorik, whose nose had earlier detected foreign scents on Nira's clothing, stepped forward with suspicion clear in his weathered features. "If your people have been watching us for 3 winters, why reveal yourself now? Why not simply return south with your intelligence and leave us to our fate?" The question seemed to cause Nira genuine pain, and for the first time since, revealing her true purpose, her composure cracked slightly. "Because in watching you, we learned something unexpected. Your band possesses qualities that our council believes might be essential for survival in the new world that must be built beyond the shadow's reach." She turned to look directly at Krog, and her amber eyes held something that might have been admiration. "Your leader shows wisdom in mercy, as well as strength in hunting. He chose to save a stranger's life even when practical considerations argued against it." Then her gaze shifted to Vera, and the complex emotions between them seemed to crystallize into something approaching respect. "Your firekeeper possesses the courage to embrace new knowledge while honoring ancient wisdom. She allowed innovation to enhance tradition rather than replace it." Finally, she looked at Thane, and her voice carried reverence that spoke to genuine appreciation for his role in their community. "Your elder remembers songs that our own historians thought were lost forever. The knowledge preserved in your oral traditions might be crucial for rebuilding civilization after the darkness passes." The sacred fire flickered as though responding to her words, casting dancing shadows that made the painted symbols on the chamber walls seem to writhe with life. Around the circle, the band members exchanged glances that spoke to the magnitude of the choice they were being asked to make. "You're asking us to abandon everything," said Nala, one of the young mothers, her voice tight with fear for her children's future. "Our caves, our hunting grounds, our ancestors' burial sites. You're asking us to become wanderers in search of a safety that might not exist." "I'm asking you to choose life over death," Nira replied with gentle firmness. "The sacred places you would leave behind will be consumed by shadow regardless, but the knowledge you carry, the wisdom preserved in your traditions, the strength that binds you together as a people, these things can survive if you have the courage to transplant them to new soil." Krog looked around the chamber, reading the faces of his people as he had learned to read weather patterns and animal tracks. Fear was there, certainly, but also something else, a recognition that the world they had always known was changing, whether they acknowledged it or not. "And if we refuse?" he asked. "If we choose to remain and face whatever comes?" Nira's expression grew infinitely sad. "Then the council will remember you with honor, and your story will be preserved in the songs of those who survive. But you will face the shadow alone, with only traditional weapons and ancient rituals to protect you against enemies that exist beyond the reach of such defenses." The weight of decision pressed down on the chamber like the winter ice above their heads, heavy and implacable and demanding resolution. The sacred fire burned lower as the night deepened, its supernatural colors gradually fading to more ordinary orange and red flames. But the impact of Nira's revelation continued to reverberate through the chamber like the echoes of an avalanche, growing stronger rather than weaker as the implications settled into every mind present. The band's unity, carefully maintained through countless hardships and seasonal challenges, began to fracture along lines that had never been visible before. Whispered conversations broke out around the chamber as families huddled together, weighing survival against everything they had ever known. "This is madness," muttered Jorik, his scarred face twisted with anger and disbelief. "We're being asked to abandon our ancestors' bones, our sacred places, everything that makes us who we are, based on the word of a spy who has lied to us from the moment she arrived." Several of the older hunters nodded their agreement, their expressions showing the deep suspicion that came from lifetimes of defending their territory against outsiders. To them, Nira's deception confirmed their worst fears about trusting strangers, regardless of whatever spiritual powers she might possess. But Mira, ever practical in her role as healer, saw different implications in the revelation. If what she says is true about creatures that consume life itself, then our traditional healing knowledge would be useless. Wounds that can't be treated, poisons that have no antidotes, diseases that kill the very plants we use for medicine. Young Dak, who had been the first to spot Krog returning with the mysterious stranger, found himself torn between loyalty to his band and fascination with the larger world that Nira's words had revealed. "Have any of us ever traveled beyond our hunting grounds?" he asked, his voice carrying the restless energy of youth. "How do we know what might be possible in other places?" The question sparked heated debate among the gathered families. The mothers worried about subjecting their children to the dangers of a long journey into unknown territory. The hunters feared leaving behind the familiar patterns of game and weather that had sustained them for generations. The elders mourned the thought of abandoning burial grounds, where their own parents and grandparents lay beneath carefully placed stones. Vera stood silent through most of the discussion, her mind struggling to process the complete upheaval of everything she had believed about her role as spiritual leader. The sacred fire that had accepted Nira so dramatically seemed to mock her years of training and devotion to traditions that might prove inadequate against the challenges ahead. Finally, Thane raised his trembling hand, and the chamber gradually fell silent out of respect for his age and accumulated wisdom. When he spoke, his cracked voice carried the weight of memory that stretched back further than anyone else's. "In the oldest songs," he began slowly, "there are references to a time before time when our people were not fixed to these caves and hunting grounds. The ancestors speak of great journeys, of following the herds across vast distances, of adaptation and change as natural parts of life." He paused, his clouded eyes seeming to see beyond the stone walls of the chamber. "Perhaps we have become too attached to staying in one place. Perhaps the ancestors themselves were wanderers who would understand the necessity of movement when survival demands it." His words carried special weight because everyone knew that Thane had never left their territory in all his 63 winters, had never shown any interest in the world beyond their familiar boundaries. If even he could contemplate such a radical departure from tradition, then perhaps the situation truly was as desperate as Nira claimed. Krog found himself caught between his instincts as a protector and his responsibilities as a leader. Every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea of leading his people into unknown dangers based on the word of someone who had deceived them. Yet he couldn't ignore the evidence of his own eyes, the transformed fire, the powerful visions, the alien artifact that seemed to radiate wrongness even in the sacred chamber. "Show us more," he demanded, turning to face Nira directly. "If you expect us to abandon everything based on your warnings, provide more proof than mysterious objects and convenient prophecies." Nira nodded, as though she had been expecting this challenge. She reached into her damaged furs again and withdrew a small piece of what looked like bark, but bark unlike any tree that grew in their territory. The material was pale as bone and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a patch of visual distortion that hurt to look at directly. "This came from a tree in the outermost settlements of the southern valleys," she explained, holding the disturbing artifact so that everyone could see it. "A tree that had stood for over 100 winters, that had weathered storms and droughts and provided shelter for countless generations." She moved closer to the sacred fire, and as the light fell on the pale bark, it began to emit a sound, a low, resonant humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was deeply unsettling, carrying harmonics that made several band members cover their ears in discomfort. "This is what remains after the shadow touches something," Nira continued, her voice competing with the alien humming. "Not death as you understand it, but something worse. Emptiness, absence, a negation of the very concept of life." The humming grew louder as she held the bark sample closer to the flames, and the sacred fire itself began to behave strangely, flickering and dimming as though something were draining its energy. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop noticeably, and frost began forming on the stone walls despite the presence of the fire. "Enough!" Vera commanded, her spiritual authority overriding her personal conflicts. "Remove that thing from our sacred space." Nira quickly wrapped the bark sample in thick hide and tucked it away, but the damage was done. The sacred fire struggled to return to its normal intensity, and the chamber retained an uncomfortable chill that seemed to penetrate their bones. Everyone present had felt the wrongness of the artifact, the way it seemed to oppose the very existence of life and warmth and growth. In the silence that followed, the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. If creatures capable of reducing living trees to such horrific remnants were truly moving north, then no amount of courage or hunting skill would be sufficient protection. "How many others have you approached?" Vera asked, her voice carefully controlled. "How many bands have heard this same proposal?" "Yours is the fifth," Nira replied honestly. "The others chose to remain and face whatever comes. 2 have already fallen silent. Our scouts can no longer detect their fires or find any trace of their presence." The revelation sent a shock through the assembled band. 2 entire communities, probably similar to their own, simply gone without even the dignity of a final battle or the legacy of survivors to carry on their stories. "And the other 2? Krog pressed. "One chose to journey south immediately. They should reach the safe territories before the next winter if their travels go well. The other Nira hesitated, clearly reluctant to share whatever had happened to the 4th band. "Tell us," Thane commanded, with the authority of age. "They split apart," Nira admitted. "Half chose to leave, half chose to stay. The division destroyed them more effectively than any external enemy could have. Brothers fought brothers, families fractured, and in the end neither group was strong enough to survive what came next." The warning implicit in her words was clear to everyone present. Division meant death, whether they chose to flee or to stand and fight. Whatever decision they made would have to be unanimous, or it would destroy them regardless of external threats. Around the chamber, the band members looked at each other with new understanding of what was at stake. This was more than a choice between safety and tradition. It was a test of whether their bonds of loyalty and trust were strong enough to hold them together through the most difficult decision any of them had ever faced. The sacred fire continued to burn, but its light seemed dimmer now, as though the alien artifact had permanently diminished something essential about the spiritual heart of their community. Outside, the winter storm raged on, trapping them all in this moment of impossible choice, until dawn brought the necessity of action. Dawn came reluctantly through the storm, casting pale grey light through the cave entrance and marking the end of the longest night in the band's collective memory. The sacred fire had burned down to glowing embers, but none of the 17 souls gathered in the chamber had slept. The weight of Nira's revelation and the impossible choice it presented had kept them all in a state of tense wakefulness, their minds churning through implications and possibilities that offered no comfort. Vera sat beside the dying fire, her ceremonial paint smeared and her bone ornaments hanging crooked from restless movement during the night-long debate. As keeper of their spiritual traditions, she felt the burden of decision more heavily than most. Every instinct trained into her through years of preparation argued against trusting an outsider who had lied about her very identity. Yet the evidence of her own eyes, the transformed fire, the alien artifacts, the wrongness that seemed to emanate from the corrupted bark, made denial increasingly difficult to maintain. Across the chamber, families huddled together in tight groups that reflected the divisions beginning to form within their community. The Stonehammer family, Jorik, his mate Senna, and their 2 adolescent sons, maintained expressions of stubborn resistance to any talk of abandoning their ancestral territory. Near them sat Bren and his aging mate Gilda, both scarred veterans of countless hunting seasons, who had invested too much blood and sweat in defending these caves to surrender them without a fight. But other groups showed signs of wavering. Mira sat with her young apprentice healer, Kess, discussing in hushed tones the practical implications of treating injuries and illnesses in unfamiliar territory with unknown plants and materials. Young Dak found himself increasingly isolated as his enthusiasm for the adventure of travel clashed with his elder's preference for familiar dangers over unknown ones. Nira remained where she had spent the night, sitting with her back against the chamber wall and her amber eyes alert despite her obvious exhaustion. The alien artifacts were safely hidden away, but their impact lingered in the way everyone unconsciously avoided the spots where they had been displayed. She had said little since her dramatic revelations, allowing the band to process the information and come to their own conclusions about what course of action to pursue. "The storm is ending," announced Tam, the youngest member of their band at only 6 winters. She had crept to the chamber entrance to peer outside, her child's curiosity undiminished by the adult tensions that filled the sacred space. "The wind doesn't howl anymore." Her innocent observation carried deeper significance for everyone present. The ending of the storm meant that travel would become possible again, that decisions could no longer be postponed indefinitely. Whatever choice they made would have to be acted upon before the next weather system trapped them in place. Krog rose from where he had been sitting in silent contemplation, his massive frame unfolding with the controlled movements of a leader preparing to address his people. The bear-hide ceremonial cloak still draped his shoulders, but in the grey morning light, it seemed less like a symbol of spiritual authority and more like the practical garment of a hunter facing impossible odds. "We need to speak plainly about what we face," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the chamber. "Nira has given us warnings about dangers that may or may not be real. She has shown us artifacts that suggest threats beyond our understanding. She has offered us a choice between the familiar hardships we know and unknown dangers in foreign territory." He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "But she has also deceived us about her identity and her purpose. Everything she told us about her origins and her reasons for being here was a carefully constructed lie. How can we trust someone who admits to spending 3 winters spying on us while we believed ourselves safe in our own territory?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from green wood, acrid and impossible to ignore. Several band members nodded their agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably as they struggled with their own mixed feelings about Nira's revelation. Nira herself finally spoke, her voice carrying none of the mystical authority it had possessed during the ritual. "You cannot trust me," she said simply. "I would not trust me in your position. I have lied about fundamental things, violated your hospitality, and infiltrated your most sacred ceremonies under false pretenses." Her honesty was somehow more unsettling than her earlier deceptions had been. By admitting her untrustworthiness so openly, she forced them to confront the question of what evidence they could rely on beyond her word. "But," she continued, reaching into her furs one final time, "there is something I can give you that might help you decide based on your own observations rather than my claims." What she withdrew was unlike anything she had shown them before, a small, intricately carved object that seemed to be made from the same black material as the alien spear point, but worked into patterns that hurt to look at directly. The carved surface seemed to move and shift even when held perfectly still, creating optical illusions that made several band members turn away in discomfort. "This is a farseer," Nira explained, handling the disturbing artifact with obvious reluctance. "It allows vision across great distances, showing things as they truly are rather than as they appear. The Southern Valleys use them to track the movement of the shadow creatures and to monitor the fate of the settlements that fell before us." Thane shuffled forward despite his obvious fear of the alien device. "How does it work?" "Look through the carved opening while facing north," Nira instructed. "But be warned, what you see cannot be unseen, and knowledge of this kind carries its own burden." Krog took the farseer with hands that remained steady despite the wrongness he could feel emanating from the object. The black material was warm to the touch, but seemed to absorb heat from his fingers rather than accepting it, creating a sensation of cold that penetrated deeper than winter frost. He held the device up to his eye and peered through the carved opening toward the north, where their territory extended beyond the visible horizon. For a moment he saw nothing unusual, just the familiar landscape of winter-covered hills and valleys that he had hunted through since childhood. Then the device seemed to adjust itself somehow, and his vision suddenly extended far beyond normal sight, sweeping across dozens of miles in seconds. He saw hunting grounds he had never visited, rivers he had heard described but never seen, mountains that existed only in the oldest stories. And then he saw the shadow. It moved across the distant landscape like a living thing, but unlike any creature that had ever existed in the natural world. Where it passed, the very concept of life seemed to fail. Trees didn't simply die, they became absent, leaving behind empty spaces that hurt to perceive. Animals didn't flee, they simply stopped existing, as though they had never been born. The shadow's movement was deliberate and methodical, covering every inch of ground with a thoroughness that spoke to intelligence rather than natural disaster. It left nothing behind that could serve as food or shelter for any future inhabitants, creating an expanding zone of absolute emptiness that would support no form of life ever again. But most terrifying of all was the shadow's size. From his elevated perspective through the far seer, Krog could see that what he was witnessing was only a small portion of a vast phenomenon that stretched beyond the limits of even the enhanced vision the device provided. This was not a localized threat that might be avoided or defended against. It was the leading edge of something that intended to consume the entire world. When Krog finally lowered the farseer, his hands were trembling and his face had gone pale beneath his weathered features. Around the chamber, the assembled band members watched his expression with growing alarm, reading in his shocked features confirmation of their worst fears. "How long?" he asked Nira, his voice barely above a whisper. "The movement has accelerated since the last settlements fell," she replied. "Perhaps one winter, possibly less, before it reaches your territory." The revelation struck the chamber like a physical blow. One winter was barely enough time to prepare for a normal seasonal cycle, let alone organize a complete evacuation of everything they had ever known. The logistics alone seemed impossible. Gathering supplies, planning routes, coordinating the movement of 17 people, including children and elders, across unknown territory in the depths of winter. "We cannot move everyone," Gilda observed, her voice heavy with the wisdom of age. "Thane can barely walk to the cave entrance. Little Tam would never survive a long journey in winter conditions. We would be condemning some of our people to certain death in order to save others from probable death." The brutal mathematics of survival lay bare before them. Any choice they made would require sacrifices that violated everything they believed about protecting the weak and maintaining their bonds as a community. "Then we split up," suggested Dak, his youthful voice cutting through the despair that had settled over the chamber. "Those who can travel quickly go south to establish a new territory. Those who cannot remain here to defend our ancestral grounds for as long as possible. That path leads to the same destruction that claimed the fourth band," Nira warned. "Division weakens everyone and saves no one." As the grey morning light grew stronger outside the cave, the impossible nature of their situation became increasingly clear. Every option available to them required abandoning fundamental principles about loyalty, community, and the sacred responsibility to protect all members of their band regardless of age or ability. The price of truth, it seemed, was the comfortable illusion that there were choices that didn't require terrible sacrifices. The tension that had been building throughout the long night finally reached its breaking point as the morning light revealed the full scope of their impossible situation. What had begun as philosophical disagreements about tradition versus change now crystallized into bitter arguments that threatened to tear apart relationships forged through decades of shared survival. Jorik was the first to speak the words that everyone had been thinking, but no one had dared voice. "I will not abandon my father's bones," he declared, his scarred face set in lines of absolute determination. "I will not flee like a frightened rabbit from threats that may be lies, leaving behind everything that makes us who we are." His mate Senna nodded fierce agreement, her arm protectively around their younger son. "Our children belong here, where their ancestors can guide and protect them. What protection can we expect in foreign lands among strange spirits who owe us no loyalty?" The declaration hit the chamber like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of reaction through every family group. Suddenly, the abstract possibility of division became concrete reality, as the band members realized they were being forced to choose not just between different courses of action, but between different groups of people they had considered family. "And what of your children's future?" Mira countered, her healer's practicality overriding diplomatic considerations. "What good are ancestral bones if there are no descendants left alive to honor them? What use are spiritual protections against enemies that exist beyond the reach of any spirits we know?" Bren, who had hunted alongside Jorik for over 15 winters, found himself on the opposite side of an argument that felt like betrayal. "I've seen that thing, that shadow-touched bark. I've felt the wrongness it carries. If creatures capable of creating such abominations are truly coming north, then staying here isn't courage, it's suicide." The words suicide and cowardice began flying around the chamber with increasing frequency and venom. Young Dak accused the older hunters of being too set in their ways to adapt to changing circumstances, while Gilda dismissed the younger generation as easily fooled by exotic mysteries and dramatic displays. Even families began fracturing internally as individual members reached different conclusions about the best path forward. Tam's mother, Nala, desperately wanted to protect her young daughter from the dangers of winter travel, but Tam's father, Eric, had become convinced that staying would guarantee their child's death rather than merely risking it. Vera watched the disintegration of her community with growing horror. As keeper of their spiritual traditions, she had always served as a unifying force, helping to resolve disputes and maintain the bonds that held them together through hardship. But this conflict struck at the very foundations of those traditions, forcing her to choose between preserving ancient ways and protecting the people those ways were meant to serve. "Enough!" she finally shouted, her voice cutting through the increasingly hostile arguments with the authority of spiritual leadership. This is exactly what Nira warned us about. This is how the fourth band destroyed itself, by allowing fear and uncertainty to turn them against each other. But even her intervention seemed inadequate against the forces that had been unleashed. The revelation of Nira's deception had shattered the trust that normally allowed such disputes to be resolved through discussion and compromise. Without that foundation of mutual confidence, every argument felt like an attack, and every disagreement like a betrayal. Krog stood in the center of the chaos, feeling the weight of leadership pressing down on him like an avalanche. Every decision he had made as leader of this band had been complicated, but none had required him to choose between the survival of some members and the abandonment of others. The mathematics of leadership had always been challenging, but they had never been this cruel. "There is another possibility," Nira said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ongoing arguments, but somehow carrying enough authority to gradually quiet the chamber. "Something I have not yet told you about the Southern Territories." The fighting stopped as everyone turned to look at her, their faces showing mixtures of suspicion, hope, and exhaustion. After hours of impossible choices and brutal realities, the possibility of new information offered a fragile lifeline that they desperately wanted to grasp. "The Council of the Great Fire has been preparing for this evacuation for generations," she continued. "They knew that when the shadow finally moved north, many bands would face exactly the dilemma you face now, the choice between abandoning the weak and condemning everyone to death." She paused, looking around the circle of faces with something that might have been compassion. "They have developed techniques for moving elderly and injured people across great distances, specialized equipment, trained carriers, methods for maintaining warmth and protection during extended travel." Thane shuffled forward, his clouded eyes bright with sudden interest. "What kind of techniques?" "Runners could reach your position within 10 days if summoned," Nira replied. "They carry equipment that would allow even someone in your condition to travel safely south, but the signal must be sent soon, before the storms make such a journey impossible." The revelation offered hope, but it also introduced new complications. Accepting help from the Southern Territories would mean acknowledging their dependence on outsiders, admitting that their own traditional methods were inadequate for the challenges they faced. "And the price?" Krog asked, his hunter's instincts detecting the unspoken conditions that always accompanied such offers. "Your band would join the Southern Territories as refugees rather than allies," Nira admitted. "You would be fed and sheltered and protected, but you would not retain authority over your own decisions. Your hunting grounds, your sacred sites, your traditional ways of life, all would be subject to the judgment of the Council of the Great Fire." The term struck at the heart of everything that defined them as an independent band of hunter-gatherers. They would survive physically, but their identity as a free people would be sacrificed in the process. "Slavery disguised as salvation," Jorik spat, his earlier opposition hardening into absolute refusal. "Better to die free than live as pets in someone else's territory." "Better to live as anything than die as nothing," Dak countered, his youth making him more willing to accept uncertain futures than certain destruction. The argument resumed with renewed intensity, but now the lines of division were becoming clearer and more permanent. Those who valued independence above survival found themselves increasingly isolated from those who prioritized any form of continued existence over pride and tradition. Vera felt something breaking inside her chest, not physical pain, but the spiritual agony of watching her community tear itself apart before her eyes. The sacred fire that had burned so brightly during the ritual now seemed like a mockery, its light illuminating the destruction of everything it was meant to protect. "How long do we have to decide?" she asked Nira, her voice hollow with the recognition that some choices left no winners. "The signal must be sent before the next storm arrives," Nira replied. "Perhaps 2 days, possibly 3. After that, the southern runners will not be able to reach us before the shadow arrives." 2 days to decide the fate of 17 people, to choose between forms of survival that all required unacceptable sacrifices. 2 days to somehow bridge divisions that seemed to widen with every passing hour. Around the chamber, the band members looked at each other with eyes that no longer held the trust and affection that had sustained them through countless previous crises. Fear had poisoned the bonds between them, turning allies into opponents and family into strangers. The breaking had begun, and Vera feared that no amount of spiritual wisdom or traditional healing could repair what was being torn apart by the weight of impossible choices and the cruel mathematics of survival in a world that offered no good options to those caught between tradition and necessity. The second day dawned clear and bitterly cold, with the kind of crystalline winter light that made every detail of the landscape stand out with painful clarity. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow that sparkled like scattered stars across the familiar hunting grounds. But the beauty of the morning only emphasized the tragedy of what might soon be lost forever. Inside the caves, the band had fractured into 3 distinct groups that barely acknowledged each other's existence. Jorik's faction occupied the eastern chambers, their faces set in expressions of grim determination as they prepared weapons and discussed defensive strategies for a battle they knew they could not win. Their children stayed close to their parents, absorbing the tension without fully understanding its source. The southern departure group had claimed the western chambers, where Dak and several of the younger adults worked with Mira to inventory supplies and plan for the long journey ahead. Their conversations were marked by forced optimism that couldn't quite mask their fears about abandoning everything familiar for the uncertain promise of safety in foreign territories. Between them, occupying the central areas of the cave complex, sat the undecided, those who remained paralyzed by the impossibility of choosing between equally unacceptable alternatives. Vera found herself reluctantly leading this group, her role as spiritual guide making her the natural focal point for those seeking wisdom in a situation that seemed to offer none. Nira had withdrawn to the deepest part of the cave system, where she sat in meditation beside a small fire that burned with ordinary flames. The alien artifacts remained hidden away, but their influence lingered in the way everyone moved carefully around the spaces where they had been displayed. She had said little since revealing the possibility of southern assistance, allowing the band to wrestle with their choices without further interference. But as the sun reached its zenith on this second day, casting short shadows that spoke to the approaching deadline for their decision, Nira emerged from her solitude with an expression that mixed determination with something that might have been desperation. "There is one more thing," she announced, her voice carrying enough authority to draw representatives from all 3 factions. "Something I have hesitated to reveal because of the price it demands." Krog approached first, his massive frame showing the strain of 2 days spent trying to hold his fragmenting band together. Behind him came Jorik and Bren, their mutual suspicion temporarily set aside in the face of potentially crucial new information. Vera arrived last, her ceremonial ornaments reflecting the firelight as she moved with the careful dignity of someone trying to maintain authority in an impossible situation. "What haven't you told us?" Vera asked, her voice edged with the frustration of someone who had already heard too many revelations, each more disturbing than the last. Nira reached into her furs and withdrew something that made everyone present take an involuntary step backward. It was another artifact from the southern territories, but unlike the alien devices she had shown them before, this one radiated power rather than wrongness. The object appeared to be carved from some kind of crystal, but crystal that contained its own inner light and seemed to pulse with rhythms that matched their heartbeats. "This is a unity stone," she explained, handling the artifact with obvious reverence. "The Southern Councils use them to resolve disputes that threaten community survival, but their power comes at a cost that must be freely accepted by all who participate." Thane shuffled closer, his ancient instincts recognizing something significant about the crystal device. "What kind of cost?" "The stone shares thoughts and memories among all who touch it simultaneously," Nira replied. "Complete honesty, total transparency, absolute understanding of each other's fears and motivations. But once the sharing begins, it cannot be stopped until consensus is reached, or the community dissolves permanently." The implications of her words sent ripples of unease through the assembled group. The prospect of having their innermost thoughts and feelings exposed to others was terrifying enough, but the ultimatum embedded in the process, reach agreement or face permanent dissolution, raised the stakes beyond anything they had previously contemplated. "You're asking us to gamble our very identity as a people on a single ritual," Krog observed, his hunter's caution warring with his desperation for any solution that might preserve some form of unity. "I'm offering you the tools that other communities have used to survive similar crises," Nira corrected, "but the choice to use them must be unanimous. A single person holding back invalidates the entire process." Jorik studied the crystal artifact with the suspicious eyes of someone who had already been deceived once by alien technologies. "And if we refuse? If we reject this forced intimacy and maintain our right to private thoughts and individual decisions?" "Then you continue as you are," Nira replied simply. "Three separate groups working at cross purposes, weakening each other through division and conflict. Some of you will probably survive, but the band as a cohesive unit will be finished regardless of whether you stay or leave." The brutal honesty of her assessment struck them like a physical blow. For 2 days they had been pretending that their fractured community might somehow heal itself through normal means, but the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. The bonds that held them together had been damaged beyond traditional repair. Vera looked around at the faces of people she had known since childhood, reading in their expressions the fear and pain that came from watching lifelong relationships dissolve under pressure. As keeper of their spiritual traditions, she felt responsible for finding ways to heal the divisions that threatened their survival as a people. "If we agree to this Unity Stone ritual," she asked carefully, "what guarantees do we have that the consensus reached will be one we can all live with?" "None," Nira admitted. "The stone doesn't create artificial harmony or force anyone to accept decisions they fundamentally oppose. It simply ensures that everyone understands the full truth of the situation and the complete consequences of each possible choice. Sometimes that understanding leads to consensus. Sometimes it leads to the recognition that the community must part ways permanently." Young Dak stepped forward, his youthful features showing the strain of being caught between loyalty to his elders and his own instincts for survival. "What happens to those who participate if the community dissolves? They are free to form new associations based on genuine compatibility rather than historical accident," Nira replied. "Some might choose to join other established communities. Others might band together in new configurations that better serve their actual needs and values." The possibility she described was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Freedom to choose new affiliations based on genuine agreement rather than inherited obligations, but at the cost of losing the security and identity that came from belonging to something larger than themselves. Thane raised his trembling hand, drawing attention with the gesture of age demanding respect. "In my 63 winters," he said slowly, "I have seen our band survive many crises, famines that killed half our number, winters so harsh that spring seemed like a myth, attacks by predators, and rival groups that left us broken and bleeding." He paused, his clouded eyes seeming to see beyond the immediate crisis to patterns that stretched across decades. "But we survived those trials because we trusted each other enough to share our fears and our resources. If we have lost that trust, then we are already dead as a people. The Unity Stone might simply make visible what has already happened." His words carried the weight of accumulated wisdom, but also the sadness of someone watching the end of everything he had helped to build and preserve. Around the circle, the representatives of the three factions exchanged glances that spoke to their recognition of the truth in his observation. The deadline for signaling the southern territories was approaching rapidly. Soon they would have to choose between requesting assistance they might not be able to accept or facing their fate with only their own diminished resources. But first, they would have to decide whether they were willing to risk everything they had left on one final attempt to discover whether their bonds as a community could survive the ultimate test of absolute honesty and shared vulnerability. The decision to attempt the Unity Stone ritual came not from unanimous enthusiasm, but from the exhausted recognition that all other paths led to certain destruction. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, marking the approach of their final deadline, the 17 members of the band gathered once again in the sacred chamber where their crisis had begun. The preparation was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Nira placed the crystal artifact in the center of their circle, where it pulsed with soft light that seemed to respond to their proximity. Unlike the alien devices that had radiated wrongness and discomfort, the Unity Stone gave off an aura of warmth and invitation that made it difficult to maintain fear despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "Once we begin," Nira warned for the final time. There will be no privacy, no secrets, no hidden thoughts or concealed motivations. Everything that defines you as individuals will be shared with everyone else. Some of you may discover that people you trusted are not what you believed them to be. Others may find that your own self-understanding was incomplete or false. Around the circle, faces showed the strain of people preparing to surrender the last sanctuary of private thought. Vera's hands trembled as she removed her ceremonial ornaments, symbolically setting aside her role as spiritual intermediary. Krog loosened the bear hide cloak that marked his leadership status, acknowledging that his authority would mean nothing in the face of absolute transparency. Even little Tam, barely old enough to understand the concept of privacy, seemed to sense the momentous nature of what was about to happen. She pressed close to her mother Nala, her wide eyes reflecting the soft glow of the Unity Stone. "The stone requires physical contact from all participants," Nira explained, extending her hand toward the crystal surface. "But once the connection is established, distance becomes irrelevant. We will share not just thoughts, but memories, emotions, and the deepest truths that shape who we are." Thane was the first to join her, his weathered fingers trembling as they touched the smooth crystal surface. The moment contact was made, his clouded eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been wonder. "I can feel," he whispered, then stopped as words proved inadequate to describe the experience. One by one, the others added their hands to the Unity Stone. Each new connection sent ripples of sensation through the existing participants, as though they were diving deeper into an ocean of shared consciousness that expanded with every added mind. When Krog's massive hand settled on the crystal, the entire circle gasped in unison. Through the stone's power, they suddenly experienced leadership, not as authority over others, but as a crushing weight of responsibility for every decision that affected their survival. They felt his constant fear of making choices that would cost lives, his sleepless nights weighing options that all carried terrible prices, his desperate love for people whose safety depended on his judgment. Vera's addition to the circle brought waves of spiritual yearning and the lonely burden of serving as intermediary between the living and the dead. But it also revealed her secret doubts about her own worthiness, her fear that her training might be inadequate for the challenges they faced, and her hidden resentment at being held responsible for maintaining traditions that sometimes seemed more concerned with ritual purity than practical survival. As Jorik's scarred hand joined the connection, everyone shared his fierce love for the land that had shaped his people, but also his terror at the thought of his children facing dangers he could not understand or fight. His stubborn resistance to change was revealed not as mere conservatism, but as desperate protectiveness for everything that gave meaning to existence. When young Dak's eager fingers touched the stone, the circle experienced his restless hunger for adventure and new experiences, but also his deep shame at wanting to leave behind people he loved in pursuit of possibilities that might prove illusory. Each new connection added layers of complexity to their shared understanding, revealing the intricate web of fears, hopes, loyalties, and contradictions that shaped their community. Some revelations were painful, discovering that trusted friends harbored resentments or secret judgments. Others were healing, understanding that apparent selfishness often masked profound care for others' welfare. But it was when Nira fully opened her mind to the stone's power that the most shocking revelations emerged. Through her memories, they experienced not just her 3 winters of observation, but the entire scope of the Southern Territory's desperate situation. They saw through her eyes the fall of communities larger and more advanced than their own, witnessed the impossible horror of the shadow creatures consuming entire landscapes, and understood the magnitude of the crisis that had driven her people to become refugees in their own world. More devastating still, they shared her certainty that even the Southern Territories might not survive what was coming. The Council's confident promises of safety were revealed as desperate hopes rather than reliable guarantees. The evacuation plans were not rescue operations, but merely attempts to buy time before the inevitable confrontation with forces that defied comprehension. Through Nira's perspective, they also experienced her genuine admiration for their band's resilience and her real affection for people she had initially approached as mere subjects for evaluation. Her deception had been professional necessity, but her desire to save them had become deeply personal. The shared consciousness expanded further as the stone's power reached its peak, connecting them not just to each other's current thoughts, but to memories that stretched back through their entire lives. Childhood fears and forgotten dreams surfaced alongside recent traumas and hidden shames. The artificial barriers between individual identity and collective experience began to dissolve as they experienced existence from 17 different perspectives simultaneously. In that moment of absolute transparency, the futility of their divisions became impossible to ignore. Every faction's position was revealed as a mixture of valid concerns and unconscious fears. Each group's motivations shown to be more complex and sympathetic than their opponents had understood. Jorik's resistance to leaving was not mere stubbornness, but profound grief at the thought of abandoning his father's grave and the sacred places where his children had learned to walk. Dak's enthusiasm for departure was not callous abandonment, but desperate hope that somewhere in the wider world there might be opportunities for growth and happiness that their limited territory could never provide. Vera's struggle with tradition versus innovation was revealed as the conflict between her duty to preserve ancient wisdom and her recognition that some of that wisdom might be inadequate for unprecedented challenges. Through the stone's power, they experienced Krog's constant awareness that leadership meant choosing which people to sacrifice and when, that every decision carried the potential for tragedy, regardless of how carefully it was made. As the shared consciousness reached its deepest level, something unexpected began to emerge from the chaos of overlapping thoughts and emotions. Not the artificial harmony that some had feared, but a genuine understanding of their fundamental compatibility despite their surface disagreements. They were people who had chosen to share their lives with each other through countless seasons of hardship and danger. Their bonds had been tested by forces that would have destroyed weaker communities, and while those bonds might bend under pressure, they had not broken despite everything that had challenged them. The Unity Stone's light began to pulse more rapidly as their shared consciousness approached the moment of decision that would determine not just their immediate survival, but the future shape of their existence as a people. In that crystalline moment of absolute understanding, they faced the ultimate question: were they willing to risk everything they had been in order to become something they had never imagined possible? The Unity Stone's light reached a crescendo as the shared consciousness of 17 souls merged into something greater than the sum of its parts. In that moment of absolute transparency, barriers dissolved not just between individual minds, but between past and future, between what had been and what might yet become. Through their collective awareness, they experienced a vision that belonged to all of them simultaneously. They saw themselves not as they were, frightened refugees torn between impossible choices, but as they could be, a people transformed by adversity into something stronger and more adaptable than they had ever imagined possible. The vision showed them a third path that none of their individual perspectives had been able to perceive. They would journey south, but not as defeated refugees seeking shelter in foreign territories. Instead, they would travel as explorers and ambassadors, carrying with them the knowledge and traditions that made them unique while remaining open to the wisdom they might encounter along the way. Through the stone's power, they understood that their small band possessed something the southern territories desperately needed: the experience of surviving in conditions that tested every limit of endurance and cooperation. Their intimate knowledge of winter hunting, their techniques for finding shelter in hostile terrain, their ability to maintain unity through hardship, these were not primitive skills to be discarded, but valuable capabilities that could benefit any community facing the challenges ahead. More importantly, they realized that their greatest strength lay not in any individual talent or tradition, but in their willingness to adapt while maintaining their essential bonds. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them had instead revealed the true depth of their connections to each other. As the shared vision reached its peak, Krog found himself speaking words that emerged not from his individual thoughts, but from their collective understanding. We will not flee as refugees or remain as victims. We will journey south as a people carrying our ancestors' wisdom to new lands, ready to plant it in soil that will allow it to grow in ways we never imagined. The stone's light began to stabilize as their decision crystallized into unanimous resolve. Around the circle, hands remained connected to the crystal surface as they experienced the profound relief that came from perfect agreement, reached through complete understanding. Vera felt the weight of spiritual leadership transforming from burden into opportunity. Through the stone's revelations, she understood that her role was not to preserve traditions unchanged, but to help them evolve in response to new circumstances while maintaining their essential purpose of binding the community together and connecting them to sources of wisdom beyond immediate experience. "Our sacred fire will burn in new places," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of genuine conviction rather than inherited responsibility. "Our rituals will adapt to honor ancestors who understood that survival requires courage to change as well as strength to endure." Nira, still connected to the circle through her own contact with the Unity Stone, experienced something she had not expected. Acceptance, not just of her knowledge and skills, but of herself as a person worthy of trust despite her deceptions. Through the shared consciousness, she felt their understanding that her lies had been necessities imposed by circumstances rather than reflections of fundamental dishonesty. "The Southern Territories will benefit as much from your presence as you will from theirs," she said, her words carrying the weight of prophecy rather than mere opinion. "The Council of the Great Fire has been preparing for refugees, but they need partners. They need people who have maintained the old strengths while developing new adaptabilities." Around the circle, other voices joined the growing chorus of commitment and purpose. Young Dak spoke of his eagerness to learn new hunting techniques, while teaching Southern hunters the methods his people had developed for surviving in extreme conditions. Mira discussed the possibility of combining her traditional healing knowledge with Southern medical techniques to create approaches that neither culture could achieve alone. Even Jorik, whose resistance to change had been the strongest, found himself speaking of ways to honor his father's memory by carrying forward the values that had shaped their people while allowing those values to find expression in new environments and circumstances. Through the stone's power, they experienced a shared understanding of the practical challenges ahead. The journey south would be difficult and dangerous, requiring every skill and resource they possessed. But it would be undertaken by choice rather than desperation, with clear purpose rather than blind hope. They would signal the Southern Territories for assistance, but as equals seeking cooperation rather than supplicants begging for rescue. The specialized equipment and trained carriers that Nira had described would be valuable aids, but not crutches that rendered them helpless and dependent. Old Thane, his ancient voice trembling with emotion that was shared by everyone through their connection, spoke the words that crystallized their transformation. "In my 63 winters, I have learned that the ancestors care less about the form of our traditions than about the spirit that gives them meaning. Today we honor them not by clinging to familiar shapes, but by carrying forward the courage and wisdom that allowed them to survive their own impossible choices." As the Unity Stone's power began to ebb, gradually returning them to individual consciousness, while leaving behind an indelible sense of connection and shared purpose, they found themselves looking at each other with eyes that held new understanding. The people sitting around the circle were the same individuals who had begun this crisis, but they were also fundamentally transformed by the experience of absolute transparency and collective decision-making. The artificial divisions that had threatened to tear them apart had been revealed as surface tensions over deeper agreements about values and priorities. Their arguments had been about methods rather than goals, about tactics rather than fundamental beliefs about what mattered most for their survival and growth as a people. In the days that followed, their transformation became visible in everything they did. The signal fires were built and lit not as desperate calls for rescue, but as confident announcements that a valuable community was ready to contribute to the larger effort of preserving human civilization against forces that threatened all life. When the Southern runners arrived with their specialized equipment and techniques, they found not frightened refugees, but experienced survivors eager to share knowledge while learning new approaches to familiar challenges. The evacuation became a cooperative venture that benefited both groups, with northern techniques for extreme weather survival proving invaluable for the journey south. The caves that had sheltered them for generations were not abandoned with grief and resentment, but blessed and released with gratitude for the protection they had provided and hope that future travelers might find sanctuary within their depths. The sacred sites were honored with ceremonies that committed their spiritual significance to memory, while acknowledging that the ancestors could be reached from any location where their wisdom was remembered and applied. As they began their journey toward the Southern Territories, carrying with them everything essential while leaving behind everything that would impede their progress, they moved not as refugees fleeing disaster, but as explorers seeking opportunity. The shadow creatures still threatened from the north, the challenges ahead remained formidable, and the future held no guarantees of safety or success. But they faced those uncertainties as a united people who had discovered that their greatest strength lay not in any particular tradition or territory, but in their ability to maintain essential bonds while adapting to whatever circumstances required. They had been tested by forces that might have destroyed them, and instead of breaking, they had learned to bend in ways that made them stronger and more resilient than they had ever been before. The path ahead led into unknown territory, but they walked it together, carrying light into darkness and wisdom into uncertainty, ready to plant the seeds of their culture in whatever soil the future might provide.